Good evening, everyone. Our chairman, Bob Wood, is traveling tonight and unable to be here, so it's my honor to welcome you all to the October program for Agenda Alexandria. Tonight, we're going to be exploring some of the ghosts of Alexandria past. You know, this is our 20th anniversary season, and we've been looking forward and looking back. Tonight, we're looking back about 50 years to the time of urban renewal. We're going to look at some of the buildings that are no longer there, but the memories of those days still haunt us. And we're going to look at the implications of what happened 50 years ago and what it might mean to some of the battles we're having in the city today, some of the discussions we're having about the waterfront, about Del Rey, about other parts of our city where heritage could soon become a ghost. You'll note tonight we have our annual program directories available. They are given to members. Donna's been getting them to all the members. If you're a member and haven't gotten one, please see Donna before you leave. And they're also available to anyone who purchases a membership tonight. I'd like to first recognize some of the sponsors who are in the room with us and all of our sponsors who make what we do possible. Our work sponsors are Paul Kentis with 501c Fit, Louis Hoffheimer with Hoffheimer Society and Captain Token the Magician. Thank you, Louis. Donna James with Honest Air Heating and Air Conditioning. Ann Wynn's State Farm Agency. Frank Fannin of SunTrust Mortgage. Janet Barnett with Synergy Home Care. And Connie West. We also have several annual underwriting sponsors, including the Alexandria Chamber of Commerce, the Life and Planning Estate Law Center, Florence King of FMK Incorporated Financial Literacy Center, Gant Redmond of Redmond, Peyton and Braswell, Simpson Development, Renner and Company, Jim Wood of Woods Landscaping and Sprinkler Service, and the Zebra newspaper, which has been giving us some wonderful publicity. I'd also like to thank all our advertisers, and a special note to Rich McGuire, who purchased one of the largest ads. You'll see it on the inside front cover. And also a special thanks to the Hermitage for the lovely facilities we have. We've really got a sense of fall here tonight, and to Bittersweet Catering for the wonderful food we're enjoying. We also really would like to thank the T.C. Williams TV and media program. They are recording our program and it is available on YouTube, so if you hear something and you please recommend it to your friends who are unable to be with us tonight. It's never too late to support Agenda Alexandria. Before you leave, if you're not a member, we hope you'll stop by the table and Paul or Donna will be happy to sign you up for membership. With that, I'm going to turn things over to my co-producer for tonight, Michael Pope, who will introduce our panel and the program. Michael?
Thank you so much. Yes, it's really an honor to have these panelists and to have this group assembled here this evening. You know, urban renewal is a topic that I've found fascinating for years, and I frequently will pick people's brains about it in private, and so this is actually a chance to do it in public, where we have it for the record here on YouTube in perpetuity. So I will start by introducing our panel here. To my left, to your right, is John Quinn, a native of Hartford, Connecticut. Mr. Quinn came to Alexandria in 1961 to work for the city's urban renewal program. So he was on the ground floor, he knows all about it. From his office in Alexandria City Hall, he helped oversee 4 different urban renewal projects in Alexandria. In 1967, he moved over to the Housing Authority, where he served as Assistant Director for Development. He left the city in 1973 and launched a career in development. Now a real estate broker for McInerney Associates. Is it McInerney Associates or McInerney and Associates?
McInerney Associates.
I always want to say and. McInerney Associates, which he joined in 1985. And then we have, to my right, in the center of the panel here, is Mr. Tom Hullfish, a native of Alexandria. The Hullfish family goes back for at least 6 generations in the city. He attended George Washington High School before moving to St. Paul's School in Baltimore. A Navy veteran, Hullfish returned to Alexandria that was in the midst of a heated discussion about urban renewal. His parents owned a hardware store, which we'll get to some of that. cousins owned a hardware store that was demolished as part of urban renewal. And apparently there was some tension in the family about that, which I'm hoping to get to. You probably also know Mr. Holfish for his longtime tenure as chairman of the Board of Architectural Review, and I'm sure we'll get to some of that as well. And then on the far right, your left, we have Bob Montague, a native of Washington, D.C. Mr. Montague has a family steeped in Alexandria history. His aunt is Gay Montague Moore, the author of Seaport in Virginia. A 1952 graduate of Episcopal High School, Montague has a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Virginia. He served in the Navy, 2 Navy veterans on the panel, right? He served in the Navy before becoming Assistant Attorney General in Kentucky. He moved to Alexandria in 1964 and became a lawyer for the historic Alexandria Foundation, and in that position filed at least one lawsuit challenging the urban renewal program in Alexandria. That case that he was representing, the Alexandria Historical Foundation, argued that Alexandria was not blighted enough to meet the standard for urban renewal. So I want to go around the panel, have one round around the panel, and then I want to show some pictures. Some of you may have seen the pictures that have been flashing up on the screen. They are essentially before and after photos of 3 blocks of King Street, the 300, 400, 500 block. And so we will see some of the buildings that used to be there and compare them to what's there now. So actually, if we could start with Mr. Quinn to get a sense of, so some people in the audience may have never heard the expression urban renewal before, right? What the heck, when people say urban renewal, what the heck is urban renewal? What does that phrase mean?
Well, in Alexandria, it meant tearing down some buildings. You see it in Southwest Washington, you've seen it all up and down the coast. There are a lot of cities adopted urban renewal as a way of revitalizing downtowns. And that was back in the 60s. Urban renewal was really a 60s product. In the 70s, they stopped urban renewal. It was Nixon's second term. No more urban renewal.
Can I just pause you here just to make sure that we're clear about this? So urban renewal was federal money, and you had to apply for it, and you had to meet certain standards, right? Talk a little bit about what that meant.
Well, the federal government provided the funds, and they did it in Alexandria, we used 3/4. They paid 3/4 of the money, and the city paid 1/4. And they provided the money to acquire buildings, demolish them, and then resell the property. You usually resell the property at a lesser value, whatever the economic value was of the property at that time. And so it created a new building. And the building was important to most cities, and it was important to Alexandria at that point in time.
Now, when you say acquire, in some instances, people did not want to sell their property, right?
Yeah.
And so there was that was not an easy thing to
we
accomplish.
did condemnation. We only had 6 condemnation cases in Alexandria in the total time I've been involved in it. So the legal problems of condemnation were basically you had to go before, you had to go into court, and the peers decided the value. But anyway, that was part of it. To go back, though, I think one of the things you want to understand is how did urban renewal come about in Alexandria? It came about because originally in the 50s, late 50s, City Council wanted to move City Hall up to where the metro station is now. There were a lot of car dealerships up there, and there were a lot that provided a lot of land. And so the idea behind that was, let's move downtown up to Upper King. And the merchants in Lower King objected, along with a lot of other people, and so they came back down to downtown. And when they did, they hired the Housing Authority to do a plan. And the Housing Authority did a plan of tearing everything down between Prince and all the way to Powhatan, 24 blocks. They were going to level everything except Gadsby's Tavern and the Apothecary. And of course that didn't work. So council then took over the planning of it and the city, and that's when I came. The plan was divided into two projects downtown, and at the same time we were doing Mudtown, which was T.C. Williams High School. And so there were three projects: Mudtown, Gadsby Residential, and Gadsby Commercial. Gadsby Residential was really to acquire the dairy. The dairy had a huge stack on it, was spewing bad smoke into parts of Old Town. And so they, by themselves, left and went out west of here. And so then we didn't need the Gadsby Residential. So it just died, and the dairy sold their land to townhouse developers, and it was all done. Yeah, they sold the property. And so that project went by the side, didn't occur. The commercial project was important to the city council at that point in time because they had built a new city hall. They brought the city hall back down, and they built a new city hall. They added on to city hall, and they filled in the center part of what was the original city hall, which was a U-shaped building. And they, at that point, wanted the plaza in front, and they wanted development around there to support the city. And so the council stuck with the original plan. The original plan went all the way to Washington, and it shrank. Remember, everything shrinks all the way along in our urban renewal because there was vitality that started happening. Economic vitality came back.
And opposition. So let me pause you there. So part of the issue here that the urban renewal stopped as you're approaching Washington Street is in part because of the opposition, which is how we'll turn the discussion over here to Mr. Montague.
Yeah,
so
the opposition really started before he got here.
the opposition started.
Yeah, there was
the timeline, as best I understand, is 1958 was sort of the beginning of city council talking about urban renewal. This is for the newspapers of the era. Then in 1961 is when what you call the Gadsby plan was born. 1962, the city council.
And the Mudtown plan at the same time because to build the high school.
The 1962, the city council unanimously approved the demolition of all these buildings. And then the demolition started, and then there was opposition, right, Mr. Montague? Actually,
well,
so if you could actually...
Let me add one more thing. The state law was structured that you could not rehabilitate or deal with any kind of building. The law was you tear it down or you work around it. And in our world, we worked around the apothecary, for instance, in Gadsby's Tavern and certain buildings. And we divided, the line it shrunk quite a bit because we were preserving a number of buildings that couldn't be in the urban renewal project. So it had a very funny line. At the same time, part of urban renewal in the economics was to build underground parking and provide parking as a resource for the center part of the city.
One of the overriding pieces of logic here that was driving a lot of this was that shopping was moving out to the suburbs, and you wanted people to shop in the downtown area. And in order to make that happen, you had to have people come there and park, right? So parking actually played a very important role.
It did. Well, and remember, the council at that time was mostly business oriented. It was not preservation minded. It was a business oriented council.
But you know who was preservation minded is Mr. Montague, right? So talk a little bit about your impression. Well, one thing that surprised me when I was researching this is that this 1962 vote on the city council was unanimous. There was no opposition. And if you read the old newspaper clips, the Old Town Civic Association was in favor of urban renewal when they voted on this in 1962. So what was going on there? Why was there no opposition in 1962 when they started this?
I didn't get here until 1964. I can't really talk much about what was going on in 1962, but Alexandria got its historic district ordinance in 1949, and with it came a bias in favor of preserving old buildings that were of a period when the city was, so to speak, in its heyday in the 18th and early 19th century.
Now, just to pause you here, so Alexandria was, I think, the second such jurisdiction in America.
Second after Charleston, first in Virginia.
Charleston and...
In South Carolina.
Charleston started in New Orleans.
New Orleans. Okay,
Yeah.
then Alexandria. Okay.
Yeah, it was called a Charleston ordinance, but it was really Alexandria's ordinance. And this was what lay behind the feeling for preservation when urban renewal came along. One of the drivers of urban renewal was the tax scheme with depreciation deductions for buildings that got old and run down and then needed to be torn down and replaced. But and the other driver for urban renewal was, as John mentioned, the desire for underground parking. But the preservation community didn't necessarily oppose the creation of Market Square open space, because there was a feeling within the preservation community that preserving open space and having open space was an important value, as well as having old buildings.
Even if you have to tear down old buildings to make that happen?
In the case of Market Square, I think that may have been true. I wasn't here during the debate about that, but I think that open space became much more of a premium in Old Town Alexandria as time went by. All the side lots were getting built on. And the urban renewal sort of fed off of the desire to solve the parking problem as much as anything. But in the preservation community, there was a feeling that the buildings that were to be torn down to allow for that could have been preserved at least as facades around the parking garage without tearing the facades down. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction in the preservation community with the architectural result of Tavern Square and really Banker Square, because they were relatively modern looking buildings, even though they adhered more or less to the scale and height of Old Town. Their fenestration was totally modern and wrong in the opinion of lots of preservationists who didn't think
we have the
blended
architecture
in
of this
very
evening,
well. And that was what drove a lot of the opposition to the other side of King Street and caused its architecture to turn out better from the preservation community's point of view.
Let me ask you about, from the city's perspective, from the urban renewals advocates' perspective, one of the driving forces here, aside from parking and shopping and commerce and that sort of thing, was deterioration. That Old Town in the 50s was a dangerous place, right?
Well, not because necessarily of the condition of the buildings, but because of some of the things that were going on in those buildings.
Like what?
Well, my aunt and uncle moved here in 1929 when Old Town was the wrong side of the tracks, and it was a red light district and various other somewhat unsavory things. It was not as safe a place to live as other parts of Alexandria.
When you say unsavory, spell that out. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it was more likely you might get mugged if you went for a walk at night or something like that. I didn't live here then myself, but my aunt wouldn't go out alone at night when she moved to Old Town. And she was
When she was researching Seaport?
Yeah, she moved here in 1929 and was one of the first to restore an old house in Old Town, 207 Prince Street, and it inspired her to write Seaport in Virginia, George Washington's Alexandria, which came out in 1949, along about the same time as we got the Historic District Ordinance. And she was very active in the organization of both the Historic Alexandria Foundation and the Old Town Civic Association and the Alexandria Association, three preservation-oriented and involved organizations in the community in those days, and which still are to some degree.
Now, can I put you on pause here? So we've heard the pro-urban renewal side from the city government. We've heard the anti-urban, the critics of urban. Go ahead.
Well, our criticism was that urban renewal was putting too much emphasis on demolition and not rehabilitation of existing structures, which was an option that they didn't want to consider.
The law didn't allow us to do that.
This is exactly what I wanted to happen, but just let me put you on
Yeah,
pause
no,
here, because
but
I wanted you to get into it, but I want to give Mr.
The law
Hallfish in
was
first.
very strict.
So-
It did not allow rehabilitation like Society Hill or College Hill. The Virginia law was you had to draw the line, and it was tear them down or leave them where they are. There was no middle ground in the law.
Wait,
That was the unfortunate.
I want this debate to happen, but I want to get Mr. Hallfish in here first.
There was
So,
case law.
one of the reasons I wanted Mr. Hallfish on our
Light had
panel,
to be established to justify demolition.
one of the reasons I wanted Mr. Hallfish on the panel was that he was telling, hold on one second, that he was telling me that back when all this was going on, you were for this, right? You thought this was a good idea, and since that time, you have sort of come around and you have different thoughts. If you could speak into the microphone, please. So actually, I want to start by asking you about the your family's hardware store, Hullfish Hardware, which we have we're going to get to this photograph in a second, but your family's hardware store was demolished, right?
Right.
And the owners of the hardware store were your family. They were against urban renewal. They thought this was a terrible idea. You thought it was a good idea, right? Tell me a little bit about the internal family dynamics that were going on there.
My involvement in all this was before these folks. I was involved in the 50s, the late 50s. And it happened at Schumann's. These gentlemen...
We have a photo of Schumann's we're about to see.
And these gentlemen right here know exactly what I'm talking about. In those days, the Chamber of Commerce wasn't very effective. What was effective here was the Retail Merchants Association. And the retail merchants were very strong. They created the first park and shop lots by buying lots, tearing the buildings down, and creating parking lots. They also created the first urban mall on King Street, which was the 500 block and the 600 block, for a period of a year and a half, which turned out to be a disaster for them. But it was an interesting experiment. And this is in the 50s. The retail merchants strongly wanted something done about the condition of downtown Alexandria. There was no Old Town then. It was downtown Alexandria. Old Town was something the real estate community hung on.
That's actually a really important point. Old Town is a marketing term created by real estate agents to sell downtown Alexandria.
Right. Like Capitol Hill is now to RFK Stadium. It expands. But the big part of this story is the fellows here who designed it and built it and developed it. And it's so nice to see Donald Simpson and Donnie Simpson and Bill Bosbeck. These are the guys who really built Alexandria, the downtown area, Alexandria, in that period of time. But the opposition in the community was strongly pushed by the Retail Merchants Association, and they won over many of the organizations, even as you say, Old Town Civic. And what you all are bringing on is what has came after the decision was making to go ahead and do it. And then you got involved in the battle, and then you got involved in getting it done. But in the meantime, it was really a swell of support coming from the merchants.
Okay, so that's a really good point, is that these two panelists sort of came on as this thing was already in motion. Describe Alexandria of the 1950s. In other words, I think if you started talking today about demolishing 3-4 blocks of King Street, people would think you were totally crazy. Like, what are you thinking of? So what would prompt people to want to demolish 3 blocks of King Street?
Part of it didn't look good. It wasn't in good shape. But a lot of the spaces were empty and so forth. And involved in this process, after the city decided to go forward, they mandated by the federal government is a Citizens Advisory Committee on Community Improvement. And I was on that board. And everybody on the board had a subcommittee. Mine was relocation and housing, because people still lived above the store in some of these places. And we worked on that for about 15 months and came out with a series of recommendations for the city. And this is my first real view of how the government works. They never adopted any one of our considerations.
Welcome to Alexandria.
Yeah. Well, that was part of the federal government program, too.
So this is a good point. We're going to look at our slideshow here. So I went to the Burke Branch Library, which has the local history special collections. They've got a great photographic archive that includes lots of old photos of Alexandria. So if we set up our first slide here, we will see, and you might want to move just a little closer to the table, Mr. Montague. So this is modern day Market Square. In fact, I took this photo yesterday. And actually, Mr. Montague, if it's possible to move this one. So Market Square, everyone sort of recognizes this. I want you to focus your eyes on the left side of the picture. You will see City Hall, right? You see the tower, the steeple there with the clock on it. Now, put your eye on that, and we go to the next slide here. which we see, you actually can't see the steeple, but if you were to look on the left side of the screen there, it's the clock tower. So what we've got here in the foreground is the Alexandria National Bank. That building doesn't exist anymore. The buildings to the right no longer exist. On the far right of the screen is the Alexandria Gazette Building, which I have to say I have a personal interest in because I used to work for the Alexandria Gazette. This particular building is a fascination in my mind because in the old days when there were elections, today when there are elections you can go on your laptop or your phone and get your election results sort of streamed live. In this era, you actually had to, if you wanted to know the precinct by precinct returns and who was winning and who was losing, you would go to the newspaper. So the newspaper actually had a big chalkboard outside of the building, and in my mind, it was a very interesting place. So none of these buildings in the foreground are around anymore. Obviously, City Hall to the left there, that's still there. But what we're seeing here is buildings that were demolished. Mr. Montague said something that's really interesting, which I hadn't thought of, which is the historic preservation community might not have been so caught up in preserving these buildings because the trade-off was open space, right? So if you think about Market Square and all the wonderful things that happen in Market Square, I know I go to Market Square every Saturday. There's been lots of public events that have happened in Market Square. I think Obama rallies there, right? That sort of thing, political rallies. That's sort of like the public face of Alexandria's Market Square. So, I mean, you could say, despite the fact you had all these historic buildings that were demolished, this is potentially the most successful part of urban renewal, despite the fact that it demolished these buildings. Is that right? Would you agree with that assessment?
I would. I was chairman of the city's Historic Restoration and Preservation Commission for 12 years, and one of our purposes was to acquire easements on open space in Old Town primarily. Wherever there was a garden, it needed to be protected with an easement or it might get sold to a developer to put another house on. And this was, Patsy Ticer was mayor when we were charged with the very active goal of acquiring easements throughout Old Town wherever a donor was willing to protect their garden with an open space easement. And we acquired quite a number of easements while I was chairman of the commission, and the tax incentives for doing so were more substantial then than they are now. And a lot of people did agree to voluntarily cooperate with our program. And I have to give Patsy a lot of credit for helping us get the political momentum going to acquire the easements that we acquired, because she was an ardent preservationist in her own particular way, and that was one of the things she wanted, especially to see preserved, was open space, as well as old buildings.
So, Mr. Quinn, when you look at this photo and you see these buildings, which look pretty grand, right? I mean, they're no longer around. And there is the trade-off, right? You get Market Square for the demolition of these buildings. Do you think this was a fair trade-off? Do you think this was a success, getting rid of these buildings?
Yeah, I think so. You know, the problem would be like M Street in Georgetown. M Street today in Georgetown is successful, but it lasted hundreds of years. And what was it? It was bars, it was motorcycle places, it was a whole series of things. And when you're looking at a main shopping street, part of the problem is how do you get the energy in your commercial area to make things happen? And you need the office market to support the restaurants. You need a whole variety of different things that go together. The Market Square, and I worked on Market Square. I went out picking out landscaping, and I was involved in the whole thing. It was really a good thing because it provided 2 levels of underground parking, which we didn't have beforehand.
There were no restaurants in Alexandria. You only have to liquor by the drink.
That's true.
What? Liquor by the drink was a very transformative period in Alexandria's history.
That that didn't happen until 73. 67. Yeah, 67.
So
I remember having my first.
one thing that you really can't. Oh wait, we moved to the next photo. Actually, if we could move back one. So I think you really can't see. So on the right, extreme right of your photo here is the Alexandria Gazette Building. There's a alleyway
to the sort of
Right.
extreme there, which is called Sharp Shin Alley. Right?
And there was an alley across it.
And there was another alley on the other side. So on the other side of the alley that you can't see is the Hullfish hardware store, right? When you look at this photo, Mr. Hullfish, what do you see in this photo? And you can speak in the microphone.
You talk about preservation and the city's efforts in preservation. The Hullfish hardware store was unique, and it was a 3-story building with a cast iron front. Unique. They took the cast iron front off, and the city stored it.
Yeah.
It's never been seen again.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Fell
It
off
went
the
out
back
to
of
one
a
of the
truck,
yards.
somebody.
We
somewhere.
did that with a number of buildings.
Yeah.
Where there was something of importance, we took that down, and the city stored it out in some yard, and it all disappeared. And
It disappeared.
well, it wasn't
This is
there.
news to me. This is
Wasn't
very
there.
interesting.
But
So-
that was a long time ago. Somebody just thought it was junk, I guess, and just got rid of it.
Interesting.
So
But we
it never
did-
got recycled.
And never, well, I don't know what happened to it.
Making
It
news
was
in
out of the
Agenda
yard.
Alexandria.
There was another thing, at the intersection of Sharp Shin and the other alley that came through from Royal to Fairfax.
Well, actually, let me put you on pause. If we could go to the next slide here, we're going to get this. I'm going to show a photo of the alley. So, if our next slide here is, so everyone recognizes this photo here, right? Market Square. I tried to position this photograph from the exact same vantage point as this historic photograph that's next, which is known as Sharp Shin Alley. Okay, so you can see City Hall in the background. So you see the row of buildings that no longer exist that are essentially obscuring your view of Market Square. If those buildings weren't there, you would have that unobstructed view that you currently have from King Street. So on the right here is the Hullfish hardware store, right?
Correct.
So this is what we're seeing here is the cast iron front.
But at the intersection of these two alleys.
So wait, just to explain that. So we're looking at what's called Sharp Shin Alley, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if you see in the background of the photograph, you see City Hall. There is a perpendicular alley there. So there's, in the center of the block, there are two alleys that intersect, right? Is it?
And at that intersection was the city market. These were permanent market stalls that were there and so forth. There were people vending food every Saturday and so forth. But on the corner of that alley was a frame building. It was a tavern. And it had a diagonal entrance right on the corner.
It was called Errol's Tavern, right?
Yeah.
Arell.
And it
And
was
George Washington hung out there,
It was an
right?
18th century tavern, supposedly. In urban renewal, it was taken down. And it was moved to a lot at the corner of Franklin and Pitt Street, on the southeast corner, and it was covered with tarps. Disappeared.
Disappeared, yeah.
So you actually brought up something that I find kind of interesting. If you look at the historical record, if you go back to the newspaper articles of this time period, there was the only point of consternation, really, of demolishing all of this stuff that you see in this photograph, except for City Hall, was Errol's Tavern, which apparently there is some documentation that George Washington hung out there and essentially created what became the Fairfax Resolves, which was like an early version of the Virginia Bill of Rights. Was there any talk about preserving? I mean, you say it was moved.
It was good.
Was it really moved?
All this was going to be preserved.
Did that happen?
Never happened.
Why didn't it happen?
I don't know.
We
I don't know what's
don't know.
involved.
It was
You're a
lost-
city official from there, right?
It was lost
my
in time.
job was to buy and tear the buildings down. I didn't have any other role. I'd like to just mention one thing. We shot pictures of every building inside and out with the fire department. They're on somewhere hidden in the city, and you could look at all those buildings.
Can I put you on pause here? I have to say,
When
just
Bob filed a lawsuit trying to preserve them, the judge, I think it was Judge DiMaterio, walked through all those buildings, looked at them, and came back and ruled they were in terrible shape and they should come down. And I think they were in bad shape. And so that was part of it was we didn't have much to preserve. We had, in the 500 block, we had a 2-alarm fire where Heyman's used to be. We destroyed part of the block and really did a lot of damage. And so, there was a lot going on. The other thing was Park and Shop in the 400 block had acquired the middle section of that block and torn the buildings down. And in the 500 block, they acquired the middle of that block and tore all the buildings
We'll get to the
down.
500 block in a second. So since you raised the lawsuit, actually, Mr. Montague, talk a little bit about your, actually, we're not there yet, because it didn't involve the 300 block, did it? It involved the south, so what we're looking at here is the north side of
Yeah.
300 block. Okay, actually, if we could go to the next slide, please. So this next side is the Alexandria Gazette Building. I was saying earlier, I've got a fascination with the history of the Alexandria Gazette. This building is a marvelous building, right? Mr. Hallfish, do you happen to know the history of this? I think this was originally built as a bank, and it later became the Gazette headquarters.
It looks like a bank.
Yeah, it does look like a bank, right? Fascinating building, lost to history, right? The trade-off is we have Market Square, right? If we go to the next slide, please.
The Gazette office was on Prince Street before it was there.
Yes.
Across from the
Right.
firehouse.
There's a plaque, it's called the Gazette Building, right? So this is a scene that we're all familiar with here. On the right, we've got Sur La Table, we've got these offices in the middle. To the extreme left, you probably can barely see the Thai restaurant over on the left side. Now this next slide that we're going to show you actually has this building, which is now Sur La Table, and the Thai restaurant on the other end. Everything in between the Thai restaurant and the Sur La Table is going to be different in the next slide, which we have here. So this is I think the Alexandria National Bank
Yeah, they were
Okay.
across the street.
on the right. Then you have all these buildings in the middle, including the Salvation Army. So you see the Salvation Army is the white building that has the cross on it. So all those buildings in the middle were demolished, and that building that's now the Thai restaurant is actually over there, which may or may not have some relationship to Robert E. Lee. I think there's some
That
dispute
was
about
built
that.
by Simpson Back,
Go ahead.
Simpson's company.
If you could speak in the microphone, please.
Yeah, back in '39. The corner building was built in '39 because Winterthur had acquired one half of the apothecary and moved it up to Winterthur. The DuPonts had acquired it and moved it to Winterthur. And that building replaced the Mecca. It replaced the building that was on the corner, which was part of the apothecary. And we left it there. We didn't acquire it because the apothecary, in order to keep it standing, we had to go buy it. Our structural, the ground there was questionable. There had been a huge fire in that block in somewhere back in the 20s, yeah. And so a lot of the buildings were destroyed in that particular block. And so the apothecary, we only want one level of parking underneath. We couldn't gamble on 2 levels of parking because of the apothecary and its substructure.
So now, Mr. Montague, these buildings in the center that were demolished were part of your lawsuit, right? So, which he raised. So talk a little bit about the creation. This was you brought it on behalf of the Historic Alexandria Foundation, right? So the folks in the Historic Alexandria Foundation, when they looked at these buildings, what did they see? Why were these worth preserving?
They were concerned
If you
also,
speak to the audience,
they were
please.
also concerned about the buildings in the next 2 blocks up. And
We've got photos of them too.
And their view was that they were not blighted enough to justify demolition, even though they might have looked shabby, weren't being properly maintained.
This photo is from the 60s. Do these buildings look shabby? Are these?
I don't think they look shabby enough to demolish right now.
No, yeah. Well, no, they had to be done.
But they were because of
Could you speak at the microphone?
because of the momentum behind getting underground parking and the feeling that the facades couldn't withstand having the rest of the building taken away from them, they might collapse. But we didn't agree with that position. We thought the facades could have been preserved and made part of the streetscape indefinitely with something new behind them and underneath them. But John has pointed out the issues with regard to the apothecary shop and how excavation could undermine the stability of those walls in ways that maybe I wouldn't have fully understood because I'm not a structural engineer or anything like that. But these were part of what we call the Tude Ensemble of the Historic District of Alexandria. And the district as an entity, we felt needed all of these buildings to preserve its integrity, both its commercial buildings and its residential buildings. And the problem for commercial buildings was that they were subject to the depreciation deduction, which wouldn't have applied to people's residences. People would tend to keep up their houses indefinitely because they weren't given the tax deduction for depreciating them unless they were either rental properties or commercial properties.
So, Mr. Hellfish, I'd like to tap your brain as a former BAR chairman, right? So you're looking at these buildings, and there's this proposal to demolish them. Is there anything, are these buildings worth saving, at least the facades, or especially compared to what's there now? Or what should have happened?
We've constantly had the question, is this building worth saving? And some people have said, well, because it's old, it is. But just being old per se isn't necessarily something you need to preserve. What is missing here is that Alexandria, a lot of people think, is a 18th century town. It's really not. It's predominantly in late 19th century. Many of these buildings are late 19th century.
Victorian.
And for example, if you look at Historic Alexandria street by street, which was published in '76, they don't have any of this urban renewal section. They have a whole page describing what was lost, but they don't go into it. And when they go into the residential properties, you can go down a block and they'll pick up houses that appear to be 18th century or early 19th century. The late 19th century houses are totally ignored by that book.
Alexandria only has about 100 18th century buildings.
Next,
And
wait a second. Go ahead, Mr. Quinn.
The buildings on Washington Street were all torn down. They were all turn of the century, for the most part, buildings, and they were all cataloged by the Library of Congress.
On the issue of cataloging, you said earlier that all the buildings that were torn down as part of urban renewal were photographed inside and outside. I just have to say, for the record, I spent lots of time at the Barrett Branch Library, which has all of these photos. And there are none of these photos you're talking about. So I'd love to, were they put in the same place as the building facades? Because if so, they've been thrown in the garbage can.
The other group that cataloged the buildings on the south side was the Department of Interior. They came, Trudy Fowler one morning bugged Henry Fowler, and they were going over to a meeting at the White House, and he got on Udall and Weaver, who was head of health. And next thing I knew, I had a slew of people coming down wanting to see all these buildings and photograph them all. So the Department of Interior also has a catalog of all the buildings.
We need them at the Barrett Branch Library. So if we could go to the next slide here, we will see a scene that we're all familiar with here. We see the intersection of Pitt and King. And then if we go to the next slide here, we can see what is known as the north side of that block, which includes some very grand buildings. In fact, this building in the middle, is this a theater of some sort? The one with the facade, the tallest building here. I believe that's some kind of theater. This is approximately where the CVS is now located, right?
No, it's another block.
Could we go back? If we could go back one slide.
This is the 400 block.
400 block. That was
This is the 400 block, right? This is the 400.
No, you're on the opposite side.
This is the north side of the 400 block, right?
Payments moved.
So if we go to the next slide, this is the north side of the 400 block. So any of these buildings here of note, none of these buildings are around. Should any of these have been saved, or what do we think about this block?
When I look at these, I think so. When I look at the National Preservation Organization's photographs every month of the buildings that have been saved, some of these are on there, or should be on there.
Yeah, it should be.
Because many communities around the
There were a lot of
country
buildings
are
that should have been
saving
saved.
buildings like this.
Yeah.
And urban renewal
National
changed its
Trust.
policy after our urban renewal and didn't do as much demolition. And the federal government got deeper into preserving after urban renewal.
It wasn't the federal government, it was the state. Society Hill was a federal program.
We saved the Lloyd House with federal money and the
Right.
Lyceum with
Yeah,
federal money
but
from
when we
other
were dealing,
programs.
you either set it aside or you tore it down. There was no choice.
I'm sorry, say again? Say that again, please.
You either set it aside, eliminate it from which we did with the apothecary and the corner building I just talked about, or you tore it down. That was the state law. There was no in between in our Virginia law. And so in other states, such as Philadelphia, certainly did Society Hill. They restored a number of buildings. Same with College Hill and Providence. You know, buildings were restored in other states. We couldn't do it. We were stuck with.
Well, but there was feeling that you should have been able to do it, whether you could or
Well,
not.
the buildings were in bad shape when we got them. I can tell you, people were living.
This is a very old photo, as you can tell from the automobiles, right? So, so you're saying by the time the 1960s came around, this block did not look like this. It looked significantly deteriorated from this, right?
This is out of the 20s and 30s.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is probably a 1920s era photograph, actually. Right?
Yeah, no, the buildings had deteriorated a great deal.
Worth
The
saving.
upstairs weren't used at all. There were pigeons roosting in the upstairs because somebody left windows out. They were in disaster. A couple of the buildings, the people that unloaded the boats down at the waterfront lived above those, and they used to work the boats and then drink, and they lived in just deplorable conditions. So the buildings had deteriorated a great deal by the time we got them. They were in bad shape.
If we could go to the next photo here, we see the other side of the street, which is the south side of the 400 block. So what you now see is what was originally the Holiday Inn Hotel.
Now it's
Was
the
up until
Alexandrian.
now it's the Alexandrian. It was up until recently the Hotel Monaco. It's now a Marriott property. Known as the Alexandrian. So if we go back in time,
That was a BAR fight right there.
wait. I'm sorry. Go back to the modern day. So what's the BAR fight?
The size of it. And we've never seen a 6 or 7 story colonial
Yeah, that's
building.
right. That's correct.
Well,
So obviously they got what they want,
I set
right?
the height limit on the renewal plan by going up to Washington Street and taking the white building on Washington Street. I actually took a transit, and
The cotton factory.
the cotton factory, and it was 62 feet high, and that's what we set the height limit down here at, because we didn't want to be higher than the highest building in Old Town. And although the other buildings had been built higher, but,
You know what
but
you-
the point was that we did that.
What you can't see from this photo, if you were to go down King Street and then turn right on Royal Street, there is part of this building that apparently used to be a disco, and the entrance of it was the
No, that
entrance
was-
to the disco.
that was on
This is the
Royal.
oral history.
Yeah,
So,
it was a good spot.
It
the
was
reason-
terrific.
The reason I think Bill Vosbeck was there several times.
the reason I bring this up is because that spot that's part of what was originally the Holiday Inn building, which had the disco, was the original home of the editor of the Alexandria Gazette, Samuel Snowden. And his house was demolished to build this building. And when I first moved here, this was still the Holiday Inn. When you go into the lobby, they had this display case that had sort of artifacts from Alexandria, the city's history, and they had blocks from the old press that were pulled out of the backyard when they created this building. And I thought that was really cool. I don't know what happened to those. It's sort of like the facade of your building and your photos that don't exist anymore.
Did you read about Ellsworth and Jackson and the
So this is
Marshall
also
House?
this. Well, actually, if we could go to the old slide here, okay. To your right, you will see a building that is the Alcohol Control Board building.
Yes,
right?
that's what.
The
and
ABC
that
building.
went all the way
This
down.
building replaced the famous Marshall House. So the Marshall House, which many people in this audience probably know, was a scene of a very famous Civil War episode involving a Union officer and a Confederate supporter who both shot each other. They both died. It was, by some accounts, the first deaths of the Civil War, the first Union death and the first Confederate death. And that building, which is really important to history, was demolished to build that structure on your right, which was an Alcohol Control Board building.
and when the Marshall House was demolished, it was in good condition. It was
So-
not in bad condition.
So how is it possible this historic building was demolished to build an ABC office? How did that happen?
And school.
And store, right. It was a storefront location and also had offices, right. How did that happen? No? Okay, right. So,
The state, I can tell you, the state had no building code. They could come in and do anything they wanted to, any way they wanted to. When we couldn't acquire that corner, which was in our way, I had to go buy another piece of property and swap it. And the only way
go to
that
the next
happened,
slide, please. Actually, this is another view of the same building. I just want to get
I had-
Or,
I-
no, it's not. Never mind. Go back, please.
But anyway, the point is, I bought the property up in the north end of town, which they moved to, and then we were able to do this on a swap deal. But we only could do it after a new administration came in. They blocked us for probably 5-6 years.
Okay, if we could go to our next block. So we're strolling down memory lane, so to speak, right? So this is sort of mid-block on the north side of the 500 block of King Street. This is what it looks like today. We're all familiar with this. If we go to the next slide here, we will see what used to be there, what are we seeing in this? I'll ask you, Mr. Hallfish. What are we seing in this photograph?
Well, there's a bank right here.
Right, so you need to speak in the microphone here.
That was a good thing.
So actually, we actually have, if you go to the next slide, Terry, so I think we have a full-on view. Yes, this is the
And we had a fellow here in the real estate business, Don McNary, and Don said, "This is the only marble doghouse we have in town."
That's a good line. So this building looks kind of grand. I mean, marble
Yeah,
doghouse.
it is.
So this was demolished. This was
It was taken down.
It was taken down, right. This is the kind of thing that it is the clash, the sort of mental clash of urban renewal. So you think about the buildings that were lost to build what's there. Mr. Montague, I'll ask you, is this a building worth saving? Is this the kind of thing that should be around today on King Street?
It looks better than the bank that replaced it, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, if you could speak into the microphone, please.
Excuse me, it looks better than the bank that replaced it, as far as the architecture is concerned.
But
And
this
it's a
wasn't
sound structure. I wouldn't have wanted to see it demolished,
This wasn't a historic structure.
but it wasn't.
This was not.
It was not.
Why do you say
Not
that?
historic.
It was not.
No,
Compared
it
to
wasn't a
some of the
historic
others.
structure.
That was
And
built in the 40s.
secondly, the bank
It's
built
a
their
modern
own building without
modern
urban
building.
renewal. We didn't acquire the corner. We only acquired what was now Banker Square. The bank went ahead and
Terry,
built
could
the
you go back?
entire, their building was built without urban renewal. We excluded them. Back to
Back
my
one more.
thing of excluding, where somebody came along, we excluded them, and they went ahead.
Yeah, okay, wait, I'm sorry. So you were saying Banker Square is the left part of this?
The right.
Excuse me,
The
right part.
left was First and Citizens Bank.
I see, okay, right.
Which later became a lot of other
So
things.
the distinction that you're making between these two structures was what?
The distinction I'm making is the left side, the bank went ahead without any assistance at all from urban renewal. They owned the land and they did it by themselves. There was no city involvement in that building. So they went ahead and built that. We provided Banker Square, which was the wraparound of that bank, what ended up being the bank. We acquired that.
The bank building is something the Architectural Review Board dropped the ball on, as far as I was concerned, or some of the other preservations.
Now, apparently, one of the controversies here is the color of the brick.
That's
And
true.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the brick color and the fenestration are what are wrong in Old Town. The Historic District Ordinance specifies architectural features of a certain era, and this is definitely not from that era.
I think it became an
It
economic
was an honestly
issue.
modern building, but
Yeah.
it didn't have any place in Old Town.
Became an economic issue because the bank threatened to go move elsewhere, and the city council wanted to hold the bank in town, and that's why the bank was built. It had nothing to do with the architecture. Secondly, is separate from the issue of the bank.
I'm sure that's true, but the architecture is where it went wrong, not that it was a bank.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Holdish?
You'd have to ask
With the architect is in the room. If we can move on to go forward 2 slides here. So we got this is the old streetscape, one more. We get a view of the bank. It's at various points called the First National Bank and First Citizens. And if yes, okay, so to this we got the courthouse, right? We're all familiar with the courthouse. Some of us might have been indicted in this building. So that's a joke, by the way. So this is another potentially successful, right? So if you think about the successes of urban renewal, I think most people would say Market Square and the courthouse building, right? I mean, I think those were
They were the best.
The preservationists will say those were the strongest part. So if this is the streetscape today, if we go back in time, we will see this, Schumann's Bakery, right? Everybody remembers Schumann's Bakery.
That was really a landmark that ought to have stayed there.
Yeah. Well, now Schumann's continue to exist on Washington Street, right? South Washington
But
Street.
it's no longer the institution that it was when it was there. It lost a lot of its
But they still
character.
serve the jelly cake. The jelly cake. The Schumann's had a famous jelly
No,
cake.
no, the Schumann's family people still do the jelly cake. Firehook does not. They do the
No,
jelly
they
cake
do,
privately.
you order them.
Right.
We order them every year.
By the way,
Yeah, so we-
the far building on the far left was originally an opera house.
Yes. So what was the name? It had a name, right? It was the.
Came off of the alley.
So, but yeah, but in this photo, it's a bowling alley.
Yeah.
Right. So, but
Before
obviously.
that was an opera house on the second floor.
Now, okay, so that's kind of an interesting thing that's now lost because, but again, trade-offs. We have a courthouse, right? So, opera house, courthouse. Mr. Montague, I'll put the question to you: did we lose something important here, or is the trade-off worth it?
Well, we probably did lose something important, but it may have been worth it because we kind of needed the new courthouse. I didn't find the courthouse in the city hall that offensive when I was practicing law, but I probably
let me
was
pause
not
you there.
the
For
only.
some of our people in the
I may have
audience-
been a rare lawyer that felt that way. I don't
Some
know.
people in the audience might not be aware that the what's now City Hall had several courtrooms in it,
And it was
so if
somewhat
you
overcrowded and inadequate in space for the courts, so that's why we needed the new courthouse. But it was a perfectly satisfactory courthouse as long as it had enough capacity to handle the workload.
Now, I wasn't aware that parts of these buildings were taken for preservation purposes, like facades and stuff. Do you think that some of this stuff might have been taken and perhaps?
It could have been, but one around the corner. Well, around the corner was an 18th century brick building. It was Castell's Sandwich Manufactory when I was a kid. They packaged sandwiches in cellophane containers and they put them into vending machines in airports and various facilities. And that was a beautiful brick 18th century, late 18th century building. And it was removed. It was 109 South Pitt. It was removed in our
Wasn't it
conference
moved and
room.
relocated somewhere else?
It was. They used half tracks. And they moved them up King Street, down Washington, because the building was too high. It would take too many telephone lines
Yeah.
down. Moved down Washington Street. It was put on the corner of Franklin and Pitt, where Ariel's Tavern had sat. And it sits there today,
Yeah.
redone. And in our conference room, we've got a picture of it when it was, before it was moved, painting, and a picture of it where it is now.
All right,
And that
I-
was saved.
We need to zoom to our
I
photographs
was
real quick.
involved in that. I came up with that as a
That was the
compromise
only
for city
building urban
council.
renewal moved, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
Wait,
paid
that's
for it.
actually worth. So explain what the compromise was. So there's the
Well,
historical.
the compromise was the question of underground parking in the courthouse, and so the question was if that building remained, we would have a difficult time shoring it up and then building 2 levels of underground parking. And so the question came, the federal government allowed us to move buildings, and so we did it. We came up with it, and I presented it to council, and they approved it because there was a blockage on that site. Now, that particular building was completely rebuilt. This prior use, we went back, the important part of that building was, it was George Washington's, he had his survey office there. And that was the important element in the building. But the building had been a brewery back in the 20s, the 10s and 20s. It was used as a brewery. And so it had been really butchered. And then they got Smoot, got Bob Craddock to come up and restore all the woodwork. And so it was really a redone building as we know it. But there was a lot of pressure to save the building, and the building would have.
You know, we were part of that pressure.
Yeah.
All right, compromise. All right, so if we go to the next slide. So I think this is hopefully our last one. Yes, this is okay. Now, if you look on your right, you will see Chipotle. This is a terrible photograph. This is my photograph, so I can say it's terrible. The lighting is not very good, so you don't really see a lot of good stuff. But if you look on your extreme left here, you will see Chipotle, right, which is a site that many of us probably are familiar with. If you go to the next slide, you can see the older version of that building, right? This is Chipotle on your left. All these other buildings here, which are the 500 block of King Street, the north side and the south side are no longer there, right?
Chipotle was here. That's the bank. It was on the corner.
Right. Well, I'm saying if you're saying on the left side of the street, right? So none of those buildings are there, right? I mean, both sides of that block are totally wiped out off the face of the map.
The Chipotle building is there.
Right, yeah, I'm talking about, yes, you're right, the Chipotle building is there. But the building on the other side of this, all those buildings on the other side of the street are no longer there, right? So this is the last photograph we're going to look at, but should any of these buildings be saved? Should have been saved, in retrospect.
They were part of the Tude ensemble of the historic district. I would say that one of the things that we were glad to see come from urban renewal was getting underground of wires and getting rid of the poles. And that was one of the sort of consolation prizes that the preservation community welcomed from urban renewal, because in the 18th and 19th centuries there were no such things.
Now, one thing that's, I think, also significant about this photo is, like, this is where the King Street demolition stopped, and we're going to talk about there are other urban renewal programs, but in terms of Gadsby, this is where it stopped, even though the original plan was that it went further. There was lots of opposition, and sort of this was the end of it, right? So, so if we could shift a little bit, so everything that we've been talking about so far is what they call the Gadsby plan, right? So that was essentially phase one of urban renewal. There was also what's known as DIP, urban renewal, as well as the creation of T.C. Williams High School, and then you told me something earlier today, which I wasn't even aware of. There's this fourth version on Duke Street as well. So let's talk about the creation of T.C. Williams here. So
T.C. Williams was really a black community that were given the land by people from the seminary. They worked for people in the seminary. They were given this land. In the middle was one electric line that went to the middle of the property. Everything was wells and outhouses, and it was really, in fact, way back in the corner they had a little, someone had made a stadium and they had cockfights back in the corner. And so it was really it was a rural urban place in the sense that here we were in the 60s with a place that really had nothing in terms of city services. If there was a fire, there wasn't a hydrant back there. And so what we did was acquire the property and then built houses for the people that owned property there along Quaker Lane.
what about if they lived there but they didn't own property, which I would imagine is a significant number of them, right?
we
They were sort of kicked out of their
relocated
homes, weren't they?
We relocated. Most of them owned the property. I think it was really they had been deeded the property by the people at the seminary over the years. There was even a little cemetery back there. We had to move the cemetery.
They'd been there for generations.
They'd been there for generations.
Where was the cemetery moved?
It was a family. The roots were pretty deep. They date back to the Civil War, prior to Civil War, and so it was a long-term thing. Anyway, it worked out, and we provided the site for T.C. Williams, and that was as simple as my time was. It was to get that site so that T.C. Williams High School could be built, and I think Don Simpson built the houses on Quaker Lane for the people, and so that was my time. It wasn't involved. Didn't affect a lot of people. It just affected the people that were property owners here.
So talk a little bit about the DIP, urban renewal, right? So first of all, what does DIP mean in this context?
The dip means you go down and come back up on the road. It was along US 1, and there were a lot of businesses there. All sorts of things happened in the dip.
Now, can I pause you there? So US 1 became part of Old Town and went through Old Town in a way that took over part of what had been the black community, and there was lots of anger about this going on many, many generations. I have to say, he's no longer with us, but I heard Ferdinand Day talk about this issue many times, and he remained very upset about it decades and decades and decades after the fact, that US Route 1 was routed through the historic African-American neighborhood, and what he felt like destroyed their neighborhood by routing a major highway through it.
Well, they were, at one time, they were going to put Metro right between the two ones. That was one of the proposals that came up. And they were going to tear everything down. And the other proposal was to take US 1 down below grade and have the city streets serving each side and take everything out. And all those those died, there were a lot of ideas and things thrown around. At one time, there was a proposal to run the parkway along the waterfront. All these things happened over time and were discarded because of the politics. So there were a lot of ideas, but very few got implemented. So the dip was a project between Gibbon and Duke Street and Columbus and the other side of Henry. And so we did that project. It was really, when we relocated a lot of the families that lived there, if they owned property, we provided access to housing that they could buy or housing they could live in.
Let me ask you a question that we have from the audience here, which looks at what happened with the creation of T.C. Williams and what happened in the dip as being something that displaced African American families and is known by some people as urban removal.
Now,
What's your perspective on that?
I think we did a good job. We worked, I met with the black community weekly at the basement of the Alfred Street Baptist Church. There were a lot of people involved in the black community at that time. The church was heavily involved. Lionel Hope, who became a city councilman. You had Nelson Green. You had a lot of people involved in that, and I worked with all of them. And I can tell you, it wasn't intended to be, and we were very careful with that. It wasn't urban removal. The problem with it was you had brickyards, you had a variety of things in that scattered throughout there, and the question was, how are you dealing with that and live with people living side by side with businesses? And it was a mixture of property. The other thing was the train came right through the middle of the dip and went to the tunnel and went down to the waterfront, and that was a problem. There were a lot of issues that went with US 1. Also, the traffic. The traffic was always heavy. It's heavy today. It was heavy then. It was the access, was a principal access along with Washington Street to go south.
Mr. Montague, I'm curious about the reaction of the historic preservation community on either the dip or the creation of T.C. Williams.
We did not get involved with them because they weren't within the historic district. So we didn't get that involved in what happened there. We were very sort of focused on buildings in the historic district.
Well, Mr. Hallfish, the reaction of the city then to the dip and the creation of T.C. Williams.
There was no particular reaction from the preservation side of the city. And the dip was not in the historic district.
Neither was T.C. Williams. We were fighting to preserve the city's most historic territory, and we didn't get involved in any other fights.
And the dip had been the dip for generations. That wasn't a new term or a new name.
Okay, so we're getting toward the end of our time period. So I want to ask all of our panelists, we'll go around, to talk about any lessons learned from urban renewal, sort of looking ahead. How can we take these lessons and apply them to what's going on in Old Town, on the waterfront, in Del Rey, on the West End? What do you think, Mr. Montague?
Well, I've been involved in fighting about the waterfront for years, mainly to get parkland on the waterfront where the river used to be. It's a fairly involved story, but when the District of Columbia was created, it was created out of land given by Maryland, and Maryland at that time owned the bottom of the Potomac River to a certain level on the Alexandria shoreline known as the 1791 watermark. And anything east of that was considered federal if it had been filled, and therefore subject to the federal title claim. And that was one of the most important things that I've been involved in my years here in Alexandria. I ran for city council in 1973 because of the city having given a special use permit to build 4 19-story high-rises on what is today Founders Park. And I won the primary. I didn't win the general election. Ellen Pickering won 3 years later on the same sort of platform and did serve. We went to court over it and won because of the title question. We were right on the law as to who owned that property at Founders Park. And this was the genesis of parkland all along the city's waterfront that had once been in the bottom of the river. It varies in width depending on how much was filled. So we have Orinoco Bay Park, which is a big one, and we have have much narrower strips of parkland north of that and south of that. But we have a park at the foot of Prince Street, and Jones Point Park is a part of the system that existed before this fight ever started to erupt. It was really the foundation of the Alexandria waterfront park system. But that, to me, is one of the more important things government has managed to do in the city since I've lived here, is to establish parkland on what really was floodplain land and shouldn't have been built on anyway, and didn't belong to the so-called owner that the city was prepared to recognize until they got brought up short.
So, Mr. Hulfish, I'm curious about the internal conflict you have in your head of supporting urban renewal and opposing it. With that in mind, what lessons can we draw from this, looking ahead to the city's future on all parts of the city?
Hindsight is beautiful, but we weren't able to cherry pick which ones we wanted to save, as you can tell from John's presentation. They were taking a specific area. Only in a couple of situations did they give at all. But when I look at the National Trust Preservation News and see the buildings that are being preserved around the country in the same period from these, looking very much like many of these, it would have been nice if we could have saved some.
It really would have.
Yeah.
We lost
So how do we take that lesson and learn? I mean, how do we take what you're saying and make that happen in the city?
Be careful when you try to do something like urban renewal and the stuff that's going on the waterfront. Be very, very careful that it's maybe too late. Again, I mentioned earlier, we had bumper stickers years ago that said, "Don't Georgetown Alexandria." That's already been done. That ship's gone. And let's be careful. And what he talks about, the waterfront, unfortunately, if you're a citizen of Alexandria, there is no way you can put a boat in the water.
Well, we do need a boat club, and waterfront uses do belong on the waterfront.
You really, and some use.
Yeah, and we were a great seaport, and we're really not anymore, and I'm sorry that that's the case. But from a purely preservationist point of view, I would much rather have seen the Woodrow Wilson Bridge be a tunnel, so that the vista down the river had been restored to what it looked like when George Washington lived in Alexandria.
If you've ever driven in
we
the
fought
Hampton
to get that
Roads
made
area
tunnel.
where you drive under the river, I don't know. I mean, it's getting around the Hampton Roads area where you have to drive under
Yeah,
the river.
well,
That's not very practical.
They do it in Baltimore.
Yeah,
they do it in
they
New
happen
York.
all over the
Every
place. It
city except
it would have been
Washington has
simpler.
tunnels.
So I do want to ask you about your thoughts about moving ahead, but actually we've got a question from the audience that is intriguing to me. So the role of Mayor Beatley in urban renewal. So when I was looking at,
Don't go there.
well, I want to go there. That's the unofficial
I'll
motto of
I'll answer
Alexandria.
that question. It was long meetings. I got up one night and on an urban renewal project at 3 o'clock in the morning, and council was still meeting, and they were supposed to take me up, and they adjourned. And I sat there from 7 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning. And that was he let anybody and everybody speak, and so it went on and on and on.
Well, the night they saved the Lyceum, it was 2 a.m. when they got around to it.
Yeah. So long meetings, as Chuck Beatley's left us with.
Well, now he wasn't actually mayor for a lot of the action.
Frank Mann.
Frank Mann was mayor.
Frank Mann was the mayor when we were doing it, and I can tell you, we ran up against Thurman Arnold owned property. He walked into a city council. I was there one night. He walked into a city council meeting, stood up in the middle of the council, and just all of a sudden said, "Mr. Mayor, I want to be recognized." And it started between Frank and Thurman Arnold. And it went on for at least 15
We
or 20
almost
minutes.
had that this evening with our guest over. So
There was always a lot of excitement at the city council meetings back in those days.
you know, on that point, and I do want to get your thoughts on moving forward, but one of the newspaper articles I came across involving a vote that happened after midnight, so they were voting on the demolition permits for the 300, 400, and 500 blocks. So this is a huge tract of land that was just going to be demolished. Most of the 300 block, all of the 400 block, all the 500 block on the south side of King Street. They had this meeting, and they ended up going property by property, and there was only one vote against, and it was Jack Tyser. And I have to say, a lot of my interest in this was was created by my conversations with Jack Tyser, who sadly is no longer with us, but he was really against urban renewal and remained against urban renewal many, many, many decades later. He thought all these buildings should have been preserved. He thought it was a mistake, and he was the one lone vote against demolishing all those properties.
I knew Jack pretty well, and he would represent Old Town, so he was the Old Town spokesman, and that's what his job was, really, to represent Old Town.
That's true.
And I, it wasn't personal. One of the things that happens in all of these things, everything today becomes personal. I remember being in the flower shop arguing with Jimmy Carroll, who was opposed to something I was doing, and everybody in the flower shop was looking at us like we were crazy. And then all of a sudden Jimmy said, "Let's go to lunch." And we'd stop and go to lunch and never talk about it again. And that was the politics then. It wasn't like it is today. It was, you were still friends with people, even if you didn't agree with them on any one issue. You still were friends with them, and that
was
true
before
in
the Trump
Alexandria.
era, right?
Well, on Tuesday, before the city council meeting, you went to Schumann's for lunch. And everybody sat at one long table. And by the end of lunch, you knew how they were going to vote.
Schumann should have been preserved.
Yeah. You knew how everybody was going to
Okay,
vote.
we're having so much fun, we can continue this indefinitely, but I will ask you, Mr. Quinn, to give us any kind of lessons that we have learned from this, right? So the city has all kinds of plans and looking ahead, and there's North Old Town, people are thinking about doing things. Del Rey is in the midst of all kinds of changes. The West End has plans. This area that we're in is in the state of flux. What lessons can we learn from this in terms of mistakes and things that were done well?
I don't think there's much you can learn. It was done at a point in time, and it was done by people that wanted it. The politicians wanted it to be done, a lot of people wanted it to be done, and it was done. And it may not be perfect in everybody's view, but it's there, and it's real, and our offices are in the Courthouse building, and I drive my car into the garage, and I'm happy to park in the garage and never get wet and go up in the elevator. I think there is something that it provided a core of business activity for Old Town, which helped the rest of Old Town. I think to a large degree, it really made some of the restaurants work and some of the other things work because you had offices that made sense. And you had the hotel. I did a lot of work on the hotel before it was done. I brought in a consultant to analyze it, and it needed to be a 200-room hotel. In those days, you didn't get a franchise without 200 rooms, so they had to create 200 rooms. That's what made the hotel so big. And it was the economics of everything at that point in time too. So that was what happened.
Also, at that time, there were no real businesses for retail below Fairfax Street on King.
Yeah.
There was maybe the snack bar and a pool hall, and that was it. The rest of it was warehouse. And
yeah, it all changed. And I think urban renewal helped it change to a degree. And it probably would have evolved today, 40 or 50 years later. And if the buildings were there, they might have worked today in some respects. In other respects, maybe not. It's you don't know. At Georgetown, I go back to Georgetown. If you go, Brooks Brothers and all the stores along M Street today, it's a lot different street than it was 40, 50 years ago when we were doing urban renewal. And if you want to wait those 40 or 50 years, sure, you can get there. But it was at a point in time and that happened and it's done. And I can't say anything else.
On that note, I would like to give a quick commercial for the next Agenda Alexandria meeting, which is November 27th. It's going to be called Ending Hunger. So everybody in this room knows that Alexandria is one of the wealthiest cities in Virginia, but that prosperity obscures an overlooked part of the city's demographic landscape, which is people who live in poverty. What's being done to address food hardship is something we are going to take a look at next month. That's November 27th. Mark your calendars. And I'd like to thank our panelists for coming here this evening and having a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.